So I hope I can speak well enough. I have not had any coffee yet this morning. I'm in the United States right now, but I'm going to be speaking to you about the Baroque landscapes in the Czech Republic and the network of connected spaces that we have in these landscapes. So the major period of the Baroque in the Czech Republic was between 1690 to 1740. The period extended from 1630 to 1750, but there were a lot of economic and political reasons why it was really compressed between 1690 to 1740 that I won't go into this morning, just to keep it short. They created what is called composed landscapes, and we recognize those, but they are very understudied. The period began in 1632 with the development of the landscape of the palace at Ichin by Count Wallenstein, who also developed an urban garden landscape in Prague. But this large landscape development was important by him as marking the beginning of the Baroque in the Czech Republic. And I'll come back to that one at the end of the presentation. The influences for the Baroque were largely from Italy. In many other places in Europe, they were coming from France. In the Czech Republic, they were coming from Italy via Vienna. We had major connections with the Holy Roman Empire and the seat of the Holy Roman Empire in Prague, and of course the Habsburg monarchy through Vienna. So we've talked about scales already this morning, and this issue of the focus being on the palace and gardens and not the landscape that is supporting that palace and those gardens. And I'm going to add another level onto it, which is the network scale that connects various palace gardens, composed landscapes with each other. And I'll mostly focus on how that is occurring. So in the Czech Republic, it has really been a focus on the gardens and palace. When we look at the composed landscape there, it's really only been at Lednice Valtice that we have that focus, which is UNESCO World Heritage. But there's no acknowledgement that this was actually a countrywide phenomenon and that this network countrywide was important to the development of the Baroque. So looking at the composed landscapes, there are axial connections. And in Lednice Valtice, what the connections are in that landscape, or what they've identified as World Heritage, is really the individual features and subparts of the landscape that were designed by the family. In the broader landscape, the broader Baroque landscapes, what we're seeing are connections of sacred sites, connections of natural features in the landscape, and then connections of astronomical projections. On axial alignments, on Baroque axial alignments that connect the palace site to all of these other areas in the landscape. The one that I'm going to focus most on today are the sacred sites, because those are the ones that we've been able to follow up until this point. We've been able to follow through the landscape. The sacred sites are largely pilgrimage churches, hermitages, and chapels. There was a long period of mysticism in the Czech Republic, in Bohemia, that did not continue to the extent that it did into the mid-18th century in the way that it did here in the rest of Europe. Natural features are rock outcroppings, artesian pools, and springs that end up being connected into the overall landscape. And then the astronomical projections of summer and winter solstices are the primary ones, and then spring and fall equinoxes. You see it as well in a variety of landscapes. So, as I said, mysticism and paganism persists here longer than anywhere else in Europe, and hermitages were common until they were outlawed in 1752. And these are not the hermitages of the English landscape. These are hermitages that follow the medieval and early Christian tradition of being located on high points and are points of pilgrimage. Astronomical projections are important because Prague during this period from the Renaissance, post-medieval through the Renaissance, becomes the center of science and alchemy and earns the name of Magic Prague. Many famous scientists are attracted to the city, such as Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler. And others. And there's a long history of astronomical inquiry and development in the country. So that's some of the background behind it. The case study palace is at Valech, and this one is important for talking about this phenomenon in the landscape because it is entirely unrecognized as an important landscape feature. So here you see the location of the landscape. It is due west of Prague, and the length of the composed landscape, the primary axis, is 30 kilometers long. Starts at a family crypt in the east, to the palace in the center where you can see the red dot, and then to a pilgrimage church and at Andelska Hora called Angel Mountain. Now, the axes here are sometimes actual axes delineated on the ground through alleys and along road axes, but oftentimes they are implied axes or directional axes where a building is pointed in a particular direction that creates that long axis, and we've been able to follow that by requiring a minimum of 2 points on the ground or more points on the ground to create these understanding of long axes and where the different points are directing us to. So the domain held over 7 villages in the region, created a large agricultural and village complex, and you can see that agricultural complex along the eastern part, primarily along the eastern part of the axis, going from the village church to the palace, with the cross axes denoting the center of the palace landscape. So looking at this idea of scales, the palace and gardens have really focused this idea of scale at the small and intimate level, and that's where the focus tends to be today on the palace and the features itself. We do have some documents. The first military map is our first mapping document, but that was created 30 years after the work on the ground ceased. And we don't, unfortunately, have a lot of documentary evidence because of tremendous losses in fire and also in the ethnic cleansing that occurred in the region at the end of the Second World War. But what we do know was that the formal gardens here were renowned for their 25-meter high cascade, for their outdoor theater, and for extensive collection of statuary, and the extent of the gardens themselves. They were produced by a minor noble, which is probably why they've escaped being recognized so far, because they're not associated with a primary family of the nobility. But this family was very engaged, as were many of the landowners at the time, engaged in creating these large Baroque landscapes. So looking at the composed landscape and the immediate setting of that, you have the palace itself and its associated outbuildings set into this landscape, of which the long axis is framed through this valley down 10 kilometers to the church that holds the family crypt. And so the creation of this landscape, the long axes and the cross axes, maintaining this long view and axis is particularly important to understanding the overall development. I'm going to focus just a bit on one of the pieces of the landscape, and that's the Hermitage complex. So the view we saw in the past slide is down the valley to the east here. The Hermitage complex is to the west along the long axis, the red axis, that extends then on another 20 kilometers out to the pilgrimage church at Andelska Hora. But here we have a pilgrimage that is identified that relates to this particular Hermitage site. And it is marked on the old maps, the original first military map, as a Lusthaus, or a playhouse. And that was after. So the map was produced after Hermitage were outlawed in 1752. And what started to identify this place as a hermitage was the fact that in the lower right, you see the Church of the Holy Trinity. The axis through the church focuses directly on this hermitage site. The only reason why a church of a very, very religious family would be focused to this high point is that it was the seat of a hermitage. So we can look at this long axis that goes through the hermitage site and extends off to Andelska Hora. Looking at the elevations and the axes that, the minor axes that develop this site, we can look at the profiles, we can look at the connections that are created here. And we can also look at this on the ground. This site of what was identified as a Lusthaus, that is a hermitage site, has visibility all the way to the family crypt. It's an extremely visible site and continues to be in the landscape today because of the landscape form. And the red line is the indication of that access from the palace to the hermitage. And then the view from the hermitage to the palace, we can see in the present day, needs a little bit of vegetation management, but is still there. And here it is on that view from an adjoining hill. You have the second access back to the palace church. And the landscape of that hermitage site, here we can see it in the winter, is a constructed hill in addition to the natural features. And then LiDAR has been extremely important for us in identifying the features. In the lower left-hand corner of the LiDAR image, slightly indicated in yellow, you can see a triangular flat platform that was created by human intervention. And then below that, we have a ring pond with an island. And then we have a grid of pathways that we've been only able to identify with LiDAR that connect to that rig pond and this Hermitage complex. And I'll show you an example of another one in a moment or two when I get to the other similar sites in the Czech Republic. Here's an image of the ring pond. And so now to the larger scale of the landscape network and how this connects in. So we have in the upper portion of this map, we've got the village church at Vidhostice to the right. In the center, you can see the cross line and the yellow axial lines of the palace. Then we have the Church of the Holy Trinity, which is the pilgrimage church at Andalska Hora. That creates the 30-mile long axes, or 30-kilometer long axes. Then the Church of the Holy Trinity is focused back to the creator of that church and the nobility who built that church and whose lands were also located at Andalska Hora. Their family lands are in Hudnice, another 116 kilometers to the south, 166 kilometers, excuse me, to the south. And how can we tell? It's because when you look at the creation of this chapel, it is a three-sided creation. And one of those sides is absolutely directly aligned through the chapel itself and through the landscape directly to the family palace at Hudnice. So we're starting to investigate those very, very long landscape connections that we have in this overall development. And as I said, LiDAR analysis was extremely important for us as we look at the formal gardens, the cascade, the reservoir for the cascade, the theater, and how those work with the axes on site, but also in developing our understanding of the overall astronomical projections, which we've been able to do to the summer and winter solstice, the rising of the winter and the setting of the summer solstice, through the formal gardens, through the reservoirs, and then connected to other astronomical projections through the cascades. So very quickly, some other Baroque sites, similar landscape creations that we have. Villa Chigi in Italy, created by Carlo Fontana. There is a long axis to a hermitage up from the villa here. Axis has a steep stairway, which our site does not have, but it also has the Stations of the Cross along another path. And the construction of the long axis from the villa to the hermitage would have been very well known to the architects of our palace in Valach. And we can see that creation on the aerial photograph here. And so these are very, very similar sites that we've been looking at. Looking at other Czech Baroque sites, which we have recently started to do, Kux which is a historical, very important national heritage site of a hospital and spa, has a hermitage of St. Anthony, very similar to the site at Valach, located on a cross axis of the hospital. And I'll show you, you can see how that is connected to the hospital itself. The creator of this hospital, Antonin Spork, was a very close friend of the creator of the palace landscape at Valach. And it was known that they met, they corresponded, and they were close friends. So we have that precedent. And when we look at this design, you can see that somewhat triangular platform with a hermitage at the far end of the platform and a formal garden above and a quadrant garden that was used to grow herbs in below with a water feature. Very, very similar to the hermitage site at Valach. Český Krumlov also has similar unrecognized connections. It is UNESCO World Heritage Site. You can see the World Heritage precinct that is in the upper left of this. The palace is above the S curve in the river and connects to the gardens. But what's interesting is that there is a hermitage here located on top of the hill on the first military map and identified as a hermitage. And you can see on this aerial photograph, there is a direct access through the garden that connects through a gate in the garden directly into the main doors that come into that hermitage complex and then into the church itself up on top of the hill. And then back to Yichin, and just to end on that image, excuse me for a moment, my computer is slow to respond. So we also have a long axis here, and this axis through the site and through the palace at B, through the formal gardens at C, through the monastery at D, begins at a high point at A, and this is a historical site. This is the site of a medieval palace and also a very, very important natural feature, natural rock feature in the region. And so when we look at that long axis today, it is focused on that, the site of that former medieval castle and the rock outcropping. And we can see that axis still in the landscape today. Part of it is actual physical axis, part of it is implied, as I said before. And then you can see the red dotted cross axis that leads through the, this is looking back at the main axis. Then you can look at the cross axis that goes through the garden and then up the hill to the chapel church. So the goal of landscape conservation here is the support and protection of the rural economy and way of life. We're coming right back down to the small scale. There is a vernacular landscape that is associated with the Czech Republic that relates orchards and gardens together in a form that you can see here in this image that is very, very particular to this landscape, that really developed from the medieval through the Renaissance, and probably before the medieval, through the Renaissance, and then was particularly well developed in the Baroque. It's the connection between the palace landscapes, which are now tourist destinations, the palaces and their particular garden, and the village landscapes and understanding the network that connects these that is important in understanding this overall cultural landscape. Thank you.